Hey everybody, this is Chris with Overclockersclub. You think of Corsair, you think of liquid cooling, and great cases too, right? But when's the last time you saw an air cooler from Corsair? Well, I've got one today. That's right, this is the new A500 from Corsair. It's been a long time since Corsair dipped their toes into the air cooling market, but they're back. And they are back with a beast. This A500 is huge, and I can tell you, just from handling the box, that this thing has some weight to it. And this is a dual fan cooler. So I'll get the specs rolling here in just a moment, but I want to talk about my game plan here for testing it. So, since it is an air cooler, my plan is to use my test system and go up against a Noctua D14, since it's a similar size dual fan cooler. And then we'll go ahead and see how it stacks up against Corsair's H100i Pro on the same test system. And we'll throw all that together here in Corsair's 465X RGB case. It's been many years though since Corsair offered an air cooler. So I'll get that plastic peeled off here. And let's see what's inside. Oh, look at that. Very nice. There's the hardware kit. Setup manual there. All the goodies, and right away, look at that, they've got labels on everything, so you actually know what goes where. I like that. Fan splitter to run 2 fans off of 1 fan header. And there's the XTM50 thermal paste. I was wondering if they were going to include any, because the cooler actually comes with some pre-applied. And if you have to take the cooler off for any reason, you kind of mess up your thermal paste. So that's a great idea. We'll look at this hardware in a little more detail here in a moment. Looks like the cooler is sort of in a clamshell plastic housing. I looked at the height of the cooler and it looks like we've got about 1 millimeter of clearance here on the 465X case. And looky there, a genuine Corsair screwdriver. That should be a collector's item. Great idea. Alright, so let's see if I can pop this clamshell apart here. Carefully, it might be stuck together. Let's see. There we go. It's coming apart. Wow, that is nice. And this thing's got some weight to it. So I just popped the top off here. I got to get the cables out. These are the 2 fan cables. These are your 4-pin PWM power cables for the fans. And this whole top piece here pops off quite easily. It almost feels like it's held on with magnets, but it's not. And there's a nice protective piece of plastic on the top of that. That almost looks like a casting. It has almost like a sandblasted or a rough cast finish. I should say a smooth cast finish, and then there's a machine finish at the top. And then it's see-through there. You've got a grid with the Corsair logo there on that top piece. So that's very nice. But you pop that off so you can look down the top there, and you can get access to the 2 screws way down in there for installation. So the center of that you can see is hollow. And something else Corsair has done, and this is really slick. I like this. Both of these fans are mounted in these plastic housings, and these plastic housings are adjustable. They have little detents. Yeah, so you can go up in little increments. That's for your RAM compatibility. So if you have really tall RAM, that's kind of an exaggeration there. But if you have really tall RAM and you can't run the fans all the way down, well, you can pop them up a little bit there to clear your RAM. Now the only disadvantage there is if you have a really shallow case You want to make sure your RAM will fit when your fans are popped up a little, because you might smack the inside panel. But you want to check that out. Now, the maximum height, and that's why I kind of mentioned that, is 169 millimeters tall. So make sure your case can handle that. You want to look into that before you buy a case or a cooler. Make sure they're all compatible. Now, the other thing that's interesting here is when you pop these fans off, and they slide right off as a unit. Of course, it makes it a little side heavy there, but anyway, this plastic housing, the fans are just simply screwed in there with regular screws. So what I'm thinking, what I might try to do, just sort of spice it up a little bit, I've got these QL120 fans. These are RGB fans that I reviewed earlier in this triple fan kit here. So I'm going to see how easy it is to pop these fans out and add a little color later. And now that I look at this in a little more detail, you've got these little spring tabs there, some spring steel, and they stick out. They're kind of springy, and they do exactly what I was talking about earlier. They're little detents, so they ride up and down, and they sort of seat into these pockets, so you get a specific amount of travel with each little increment. So that is a very clever, very good idea. I like that. Now, another thing that sort of stands out, usually when you see a cooler this size with a fin stack heat sink that large, usually you see as many heat pipes crammed into a small area as possible. But I see they've only got 4, but it looks like the center 2 heat pipes are a little larger than the outer 2. Usually 6 millimeters is the diameter that I see, and I've got some calipers here, so I'm going to measure and see what diameter these are. So it looks like the outboard heat pipes are coming in right at about 6 millimeters. And the 2 center ones, if I can find a round part there to clamp on, these are 8 millimeters. So we've got almost, 8 millimeters. So we've got 6 millimeter pipes on the outside and 2 8 millimeter pipes on the inside. Actually, something I should have gone over earlier. The box on the bottom has a nice printout there, a graphical representation of everything that's included, including the little screwdriver, documentation, fan splitter, thermal paste, all the bracketry and mounting hardware, the 2 frames for the 2 fans, and of course the cooler. And the back of the box has all of the nice dimensional information that is good to see. And then we have the technical information in multiple languages. Since English is pretty much my main language and pretty much my only language, there are the specs in English. And again, the maximum speed of the fan is 2400 RPMs. Weighs 1460 grams. And then it has the airflow, 75 CFM. And again, confirming what I just showed you on the bottom of the box, there's the owner manual, user manual, installation manual in multiple languages. It sort of goes through the installation process. So no matter how many coolers you've installed, it's still a good idea to sort of go through there. Make sure there's nothing you miss. Again, there's the 2-into-1 fan splitter. So you can run both fans off of one fan header on the motherboard. All of the bracketry there for AMD, nicely labeled. Thermal paste, everything you need for an Intel installation across your major sockets. And then a few little miniature tie wraps there, cable ties, to help secure your fan cables so they're not flopping around in the case. And looking at the bottom of the cooler, one thing I notice here, the heat pipes and the fin stack, they have almost like a dark nickel finish to them. They're not really shiny like you usually see with exposed aluminum. Anyway, Corsair provides this nice protective cover on the bottom there, a little plastic cup to keep the pre-applied thermal paste from getting all smushed and smeared all over the place. So the thermal paste, as you can see, has sort of a grid pattern there. and that will all flatten out when you install the 2 screws here and draw the cooler down against the top of the CPU. And the other thing I notice here, usually heat pipes on most coolers, I should say it's typical to see heat pipes that are actually sandwiched between a 2-piece base plate, so that the heat has to travel through the base plate before it can get to the heat pipes. But in this case, you can see they're pressed into a single plate and then they're machined across the top, so everything is flat. So your heat pipes are about in as close of direct contact to the top of your CPU as they can possibly get, which is a good thing. It facilitates heat transfer from your CPU to the heat pipe. And I count 48 serrated cooling fins in the fin stack there. Serrated on the outer edge, and then on the sides they are flat. And then it's hollow in the center to provide easy access to the mounting screws here, and these are the retained screws, so you don't have to go chasing the screws around. They always stick with the bottom of the cooler. Now it's time to get the cooler installed to my motherboard. This is an older Z87 MSI motherboard, and I'm using a 4770K Intel CPU. This is a little back plate I made there with some 1-inch standoffs to sort of have enough room to work underneath the motherboard. I use that when I do my offline testing. So the first thing, you've got this nice mounting bracket here. It has some little plastic, looks like some little plastic spacers, little gasket on the back. So what you do is, and this is for an Intel setup, obviously with a 4770K. So I hold that there with one hand underneath, and I gotta get my hand under there. Okay, there I go. Now you have these little studs here that have a threaded section on both sides. So we'll get one started and get the other one started on an opposite corner. That way I can sort of hold the bracket in position and it won't go anywhere. So you snug those down. And there are 4 total. Again, this is for an Intel installation. And this uses a mounting system that uses these 2 brackets here. So you have to figure out when these go on which orientation you want your cooler in, because if you put them on the wrong way, your cooler will be facing the wrong direction. So we get all 4 of these installed. All 4 of the hex offset there, or hex studs, are installed. Next thing to do is put these brackets on. Now, since we want the airflow to go in that direction, you want to mount these so that the studs are opposite each other. And there's 3 little holes there. Depending upon which socket you use, I actually use the center holes there, or the middle holes on those brackets. And then you tighten down these little knurled fasteners here to secure the main bracket. And once we get these main brackets locked into position, then I can get the cooler installed. So now, since zoom back out there. So I have to look at the fan position. So this fan here, when it's running, it'll be running in that direction, so it's blowing air out the back. So that tells me I want the cooler to face this way, so that the front fan pulls air in from the front, pushes it through the cooler, and the back exhaust fan pushes it out the back. So I get the mounting screws sort of lined up there. And then I can go down through the top and tighten the screws. And you want to go back and forth between the screws. You don't want to tighten one down all the way. You want to sort of alternate back and forth a few turns until they bottom out. And we're almost there. I can feel the screws tightening up a bit. There's some more resistance. And again, the key is to go back and forth. Okay, so the right one is now snugged. And the left one is installed. And that is quite firm. Now, with the RAM, remember I showed how this fan here can slide up or down based on the height of the RAM. Now, these are moderately tall heat spreaders, so we'll see if I can get the fan to go all the way down or not. So we sort of push it over. And I can feel little detents, and I can go almost all the way down. Maybe I can tell it's sitting on top of the RAM, but it's not really squashing it. So that is right line to line there. The RAM can still move around a little bit. So this is really an ideal situation as far as being able to get the fan installed all the way down, so I'm not worried about the top of the cooler hitting the inside of my case. So if the fan was up like this, unless I had a deep case, it might be a concern, but I'm pretty comfortable that I won't have any issues like that. And now that I paid attention to my fan orientation, so it'll pull air in from the RAM side of the motherboard, and then it will exhaust it here, and this would be at the back of the case, so this is where you want your exhaust fan to be pushing the air out of the back of the case. And my initial observation that the bracket seemed a little loose on the bottom when I first put it on. When you get all of the fasteners tightened up, all of that slop goes away. It wasn't much, just a little, but it's all gone now. So now I can get the power to it, and we can start looking at some temperatures outside of a case, and then we'll get this all installed into that 465X RGB and do some comparison between the Noctua D14, of course the A500, and the H100i Pro. And I almost forgot to put the top cover on there. And the nice thing is you can flip it around 180 to get the Corsair logo going whichever direction you want. But I almost forgot to put that on there. That's a really nice looking cooler. Can't wait to fire it up. And just to look down here at clearances, there's a lot of room under the cooler there where the mounting bracket is over here. You can see I'm almost resting on top of the RAM over here on the right. And of course there's just a ton of room over here on the left for the VRM on this particular motherboard. Alright, I have the system powered up. I try to keep the temperature in the room as close to 66 degrees Fahrenheit as I can. Fans are cranked up to their maximum, which is about 2400 RPMs. I went in and manually set the fan speeds. So you can see the fan speed there. It's a little under 2400. Whoops, as I bumped the camera. The processor is an older Intel 4770K, cranked up to 4200 megahertz or 4.2 gigahertz using Prime 95, and I'm kind of hovering around the 71-72C. And the fans are cranked all the way up, and you can definitely hear them. And I'll get the decibel meter here out. So with the fans cranked all the way up, with the decibel meter on the exhaust side at about 1 foot away, it was around 61, 62 decibels. And I just killed the overclock, or I should say the stress test. And then the fan speed will come down. I put it into smart mode. So now the fan speed is around 400 RPMs. And you can see the decibel meter certainly drops. So when things are at idle, it's really very quiet. And most people, I would venture to guess, probably aren't going to run with the fans cranked up all the way all the time. So usually for me, the fan noise, especially when it's, in a case, is not usually that big of a deal. So the next thing to do is to get the Noctua D14 on there and look at the numbers under the same conditions. And just for the heck of it, I popped out the Patriot Viper RAM, and I had some older Corsair Vengeance RAM with taller heat spreaders than what the Viper had. And we can sort of show off the way that the fan raises up. So I raised the fan up there a few notches to get the new memory in there. Get the old memory out first, of course. And then I slowly and carefully push the fan down to where almost right on top of the memory there. And now you can see that there's a slight offset. We're a little higher here on the right. And then we'll measure that and see roughly, it looks like about a ½ inch. About 13.5 millimeters. Let me double check that. Yeah, a little over 13 millimeters difference there in height on the Corsair Vengeance RAM, but not a problem because the A500 can handle it. Again, you just have to watch the how close the cooler is to the inside of your side panel. The A500 has been removed, and just for the heck of it, I'll show you. This is what the bottom of the cooler looks like. That's where the factory applied thermal paste was, and you can see how it's pretty much destroyed. So before I reinstall this cooler on anything, of course, I'll have to clean all that off there and then use some of the thermal paste that Corsair supplied in the hardware kit. So now we're running the Noctua D14. We're keeping it around 66 degrees. I've got the fans cranked all the way up. We're running around 73, 74 Celsius. Fans are running around 1300 RPMs, which is their maximum. And again, we're using the Core i7 4770K with an overclock of 4.2 gigahertz. And now this is the H100i Pro running at full speed under the same 4.2 gigahertz overclock. The pump is running at 2700 RPMs and the fans are running at about 2400 RPMs. And you can see we're holding at about 59 degrees Celsius. 60, 59, it bounces around a degree or so there. And if we want to look at decibels, I'll hold the meter here about a foot away from the exhaust side of the fans. And it's around 59, 58, 59. Alright, well, it certainly quiets the system down here when I take the load off of it and bring the fan speed back down to idle. So what I'll do next is get the A500 over there back on, and as I mentioned earlier, just for the heck of it, I'll throw a couple of these QL120 fans on there just to see what the cooler looks like with a little RGB action. As promised, there are the QL120s that I swapped out from the ML120s that come stock on the A500. Gives a little visual kick there. Holding the same 66 degrees Fahrenheit, same 4.2 gigahertz overclock, and we're hovering around 74, 75 degrees C. And I think that really looks nice. So you give up a few degrees there in temperature, but you get the RGB effects there if you want to swap out the fans. Fan speed difference. The QL120s max out around 1500, whereas the ML120s here, the magnetic levitation fans that come on the A500, they can go up to 2400. And with the lights out, you can see the lighting effect a little better there. So all the thermal testing is done. The next thing to do is to throw this system inside the 465X RGB. Now, for any of you wondering what the new A500 would look like, installed in the 465X RGB case from Corsair, along with a couple of QL120 RGB fans, there you are. Pretty impressive. Now, I use the QL120s because that's what I just happened to have. Thought I would throw them on there just to see what they look like. And a more cost-effective way to go might be with these LL120s that come from the factory on this 465X case. Right now, to buy the QL120s separately, they're around $44, $45, and the LL120s are about $10 cheaper. So you can save a few bucks, and the main obvious difference is the QL120 has two rings, front and back of the frame, two rings of LEDs, whereas the LL120s just have a single ring of LEDs that's on the front of the fan and not the back. You can still see the RGB effects, but you don't have the second ring on the other side of the fan frame. So anyway, this is what it looks like. And I have the side glass removed from the case because there's so much reflection. It's hard to see. So anyway, I wanted to make sure I pointed that out. I'll go ahead and put the stock fans back on and give you one last look. But one more thing to point out, again, if you do want to spice up your A500 with an RGB fan, the QL120s with the dual LED rings there on both sides of the frame. I'm pointing that out again because since the front fan, of course, if you only have one LED ring, you'll only see it from the front. But if you have to flip that fan around for the back so that your airflow is in the proper direction, your colored ring that's on the front of the fan is going to be up against the cooler there, and the back, it will not be quite as pretty as that. So QL120s have that covered. I'm in the middle of putting the stock fans back on the cooler and pulling the QL120s here off. And it occurred to me that Corsair uses metal inserts on the plastic frame. Now, it would have been very easy to just tap that plastic and put the threads right into the plastic frame. And I thought, well, those look like metal inserts. And sure enough, the magnet verifies that they are metal inserts, threaded metal inserts. So the screws that you secure the fan to the frame are screwing into the metal insert and not into plastic threads, which are very easy to strip. So over the years, I've always known Corsair for quality, and to me that means going the extra distance and doing the right thing, and that is definitely the right thing to do on a plastic component that is using a metal fastener. After a 10-year absence in the air cooler market, I'm happy to say that Corsair is back, and back in a big way with the A500. The cooler has a TDP of 250 watts. We've got two fans that spin up to 2400 RPM, so they can move some serious air. And the ML120 magnetic levitation bearing fans are up to the task. So with a 250 watt TDP rating, TDP is thermal design power, this is a fairly formidable cooler. However, Corsair does recommend using one of their more high-performance liquid coolers in a Threadripper application. Now, I love the hold-fast retention system. Again, easy access there to the mounting screws and all the hardware underneath. The slide and lock fans here, I really like that. You can slide the fan off very quickly. It locks into all the different detented positions. You've got all the additional RAM clearance that is afforded on either side by being able to move those fans up and down very easily. You don't have to use a lot of screws and mounting hardware to do that. The only disadvantage to a large cooler like this is when you do move the fans up, if you have to gain clearance for RAM, you really got to watch the clearance on your case. If you have a really deep case, it's not a big deal. But this case here, we've got like 1 millimeter of clearance when the glass cover is on there. And in fact, I'll just pop that on now. If you do have to move the fans up, you're not going to be able to do it in this particular case. You got about 1 millimeter of clearance there, and that's not going to work out too well. So deeper case, again, no problem. Shallow case, you just have to pay attention to that stuff. And the fact that these fans are so easily removable, they are easy to change out if you do want to go to a different fan, like an RGB fan. Another cool feature there. So anyway, when you consider all the things that go into a cooler like this, the overall quality, the fit and finish, the performance, of course, the price point, the ease of installation, and the way the fans are adjustable to compensate for tall RAM, all of those things come together to make a great cooler. So I'm really happy to see Corsair getting back into the air cooler market. So I'm going to give this the Overclockers Club Editor's Choice Award. So this is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching. Leave me some comments and don't forget to subscribe.